Hi, welcome to Constitutional Chats, hosted by me, Janine Turner,
and Kathy Gillespie,
with students
Takari Chapman
and me, Tova Kaplan.
Join us as we discuss hot topic issues with constitutional experts. It's sponsored by Constituting America.
Hi, welcome to Constitutional Chats. First of all, we're sorry for the delay. We had a little bit of technical difficulty here today, but we are working through it. And we want to welcome everyone who is with us today. And thank you so much for being a part of our show. So today our topic is the 27th Amendment. And we are so excited to have with us today as our special guest, Gregory Watson, who as a college student led the effort of ratification for the 27th Amendment. Now, before we get to Gregory, I want to introduce our fabulous panel that we have with us today. First of all, we have Tova Kaplan, a 17-year-old student from Chicago, Illinois. Tova is a three-time winner of the We the Future contest. She's the National Youth Director of Constituting America, and she runs the Youth Advisory Board. Tova is passionate about inspiring young people to know and use their constitutional rights. Tova, do you want to say hello?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you so much to Gregory for being here. I've known your story forever, and it's just the coolest. And it's so awesome to be able to meet you.
Thank you.
Now, also with us, we've got two new student panelists today, Jewel and Jorn Gilbert. And we are so excited to have Jewel and Jorn joining us. They are both former Constituting America We the Future contest winners. Jewel is executive producer and Jorn is operations director of Sing for America, a family-based company that the brothers co-founded. Sing for America seeks to show the art of truth and light through live performance. Both are proud former We the Future contest winners. Sing for America is an actor-run theater company which specializes in semi-professional musicals, private training in the arts, school drama solutions, and public entertainment events, all the while revealing a colorblind world on stage. Sing for America raises money for military families as well as arts education and has donated $62,500 to military and local charities. Jewel and Jorn are graduates of Moravian College, where they earned a BA in musical performance and dramatic production. Jewel and Jorn, would you all like to say hi?
Yes, definitely. We're very happy to be here. We've been looking forward to it since you asked us, and thank you very much to Gregory Watson also for your time and for your story and for being able to share that with our audience today.
My pleasure.
Well, thank y'all. We're excited to have y'all. And I also want to introduce Jeanette Kranak, who is our Director of Operations. Jeanette does so many great things for us, one of which is to reach out to the schools and make all those great school speeches happen. Jeanette and Janine both are part of our school speaking team. And Jeanette, would you like to say hello?
I would, and I have to say, Gregory, I've been telling your stories for about 10 years now, ever since I've been with Constituting America. Thousands of students across this country through our program and through our speeches have heard your story. So now I get to tell it again with more excitement and tell all the kids that I actually met the guy who was responsible for seeing the 27th Amendment through to fruition. So thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure to join you today.
And now for our star guest, Gregory Watson. And we thought an appropriate way to introduce Mr. Watson might be to just read from Juliet Turner's book, Our Constitution Rocks. And Juliet wrote a little blurb about Mr. Watson in Our Constitution Rocks, and I'm going to read it. The ratification of the 27th Amendment was due to the actions of a young citizen by the name of Gregory Watson, a student at the University of Texas at the time. It began when he wrote a term paper arguing for ratification of this amendment. He then embarked on a one-man campaign for the amendment's ratification, by writing letters to several state legislatures of different states across the nation. Shortly thereafter, approximately a year after Watson's college term paper, Maine and Colorado ratified the amendment. Then more and more states followed. Today, only Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and New York have yet to ratify the amendment. And that was from Juliet Turner's Our Constitution Rocks. Mr. Watson went on to work in the Texas legislature for over 3 decades. And Mr. Watson, we are so excited to have you with us today. Welcome to Constitutional Chats. And we'd love for you, first of all, to just start with some opening comments and tell us a little bit just about what the 27th Amendment does.
Well, first, let me add
Kathy?
Mississippi.
Kathy, I want to say I'm in, by the way.
Yay. Well, then I'm going to turn it over to you.
Only the audio. We just want to say hi, everybody. Did you thank our sponsor, Kathy?
Oh, yes. Thank you for reminding me. I want to thank our sponsor, Ray and Roxanne Bromley, who are 2 of our great contributors in Pennsylvania. And Ray and Roxanne, we thank you so much for your support of Constituting America and for sponsoring this Zoom and for all of the things that you make possible with your donations. Thank you.
Yay. Okay. And Gregory Watson, I'm really disappointed that I am not able to see you right now because I have been speaking about you all over the nation. Your ears must be ringing like the Liberty Bell, because every time I give a speech, and I've given over 600 of them approximately, over 500 something for sure, I have mentioned your name when the kids look bored in the classroom and think, why am I hearing this lady speak? Well, I can't possibly make a difference in the country. I always awaken their inspiration by saying, let me tell you a story if you think you're too young. And I say, Gregory Watson was at the University of Texas, and he started the movement for the 27th Amendment. And if he can do it, you can do it. So over 500, 600 times I have said that, Gregory Watson, and it's a real thrill to have you here today. I'm hoping they'll figure this out as to why I can't get on, but we look forward to hearing you speak. And welcome to Jewel and Jorn, our new host, and to Tova and Kathy, who I can't see. So welcome, Gregory Watson, and I look forward to hearing everything you have to say, and I hope soon I can get on and see your face.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. I do want to add that Mississippi also never ratified the 27th Amendment, in addition to Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and New York.
Thank you for adding that. We'll definitely add that. Do you want to talk a little bit about the 27th Amendment and tell us what it does?
Well, the 27th Amendment it's actually, when you stop and think about it, it's a very simple, very common sense, and very, very straightforward amendment. Congress is in a very unique position within the federal government. They are the only people within the federal government who can set their own salaries. The president cannot set his or her own salary. The judges cannot set their own salaries. Only members of Congress have the power to do that. And so there was a concern that that power could be abused. So James Madison, when he was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, prior to becoming president himself, proposed this amendment. It passed the U.S. House, passed the U.S. Senate, went out to the states, and it says simply that when members of Congress want to make any adjustments in their salaries, they must await the outcome of the next intervening election before that adjustment can take effect.
Well, and why is that important?
Well, it's important because, as I say, members of Congress are unique in their ability to establish their own salary level. And so if you don't put any restrictions on people, they have a natural human tendency to abuse that power. And members of Congress for a number of years indeed did abuse that power and were giving themselves last minute pay raises, making them retroactive to January 1st, and hiding them in bills that had nothing to do with the subject of congressional pay. There was one that they tacked on to a bill that was for the coal miners of Kentucky and West Virginia who were afflicted with the black lung disease. They tried to hide it in that bill, hoping that no one would find it. And of course, the media found it and spread it around, and the public became very angry. And so that inspired me, and I remembered that incident. So I thought, this amendment not only is still pending business before the state legislatures, because it had no deadline for the states to act upon it, but it was also still very much needed to put an end to the corruption that was taking place with members of Congress abusing their privilege.
Well, that's fascinating. Now, it is such an important amendment, and it's hard to believe that it took so long to finally get it ratified, but you were able to do it. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tova and to Jewel and Jorn after Tova, because I know what our students really want to know is how you did it. But Tova, I'm going to let you ask Mr. Watson a few questions to try to find out a little bit more about his story, because that's just was so inspirational.
Great, yeah. So do you mind just, I guess, summarizing your story on how you got it passed for everyone? Because it's a pretty great one.
Well, I had written a paper for a government class at the University of Texas. I was originally going to write about the Equal Rights Amendment and whether Congress had acted within its powers to grant the Equal Rights Amendment additional time on its deadline for the states to ratify it. I went to the downtown Austin Public Library, found a book that had within it a chapter of amendments that Congress had sent to the state legislatures, but which not enough states had ratified. And that's when I found this amendment from the year 1789 dealing with congressional compensation. And I thought, ERA is very interesting, yes. However, I think that this other amendment from the year 1789 is even more interesting because it had no deadline at all on its ratification for the states, and it was still very much needed because of the abuses that members of Congress were engaging in. So I switched the topic of my paper. I wrote about the Congressional Compensation Amendment and put a lot of love into that paper, and was so disappointed when I turned it in and got it back a few days later from the teaching assistant with a C on it. And so I thought, well, never mind what he thinks. I'm going to go talk to the professor and ask her to take a look at it and see if she will reevaluate that grade. So I went and visited with her in her office. She assured me that she would take a look at the paper and get back with me as soon as possible. So the next day that the class convened, when she came in, she physically hurled the paper at me and said, "No change." And so that was very, very upsetting to me because, number one, I knew that the amendment was still pending business before the states. I knew that there were abuses that Congress was engaging in, which justified ratifying the amendment, albeit more than 190 years later. And so I thought right then and there, I'm going to get that thing ratified. And so I started out with members of Congress who I knew were sympathetic to the concept. And I wrote letters to several of them. One of them was actually kind enough to reply. And that was former United States Senator William S. Cohen of the state of Maine. And in my letter to Senator Cohen, I asked him if he could think of anyone within the legislature of the state of Maine who he thought might be willing to offer a resolution at the state capitol to ratify the compensation amendment. And he said, yes, I know exactly the person who should do that. Not only is he a member of the Maine legislature, but when the legislature is not in session, he doubles as a member of my staff on the U.S. Senate. So he would be the one to do that. Well, something must have happened to that gentleman. Maybe he didn't get reelected in November of 1982. I don't know the exact story, but it ended up being a different gentleman who filed the resolution in the Maine Senate in 1983. That was Senator Melvin Shute. Senator Shute passed it through the Maine Senate. He passed it through the Maine House of Representatives. And on April the 27th of 1983, the Maine legislature had ratified the amendment that we know today as the 27th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Now, once that success story was under my belt, there was no turning back. I had to pursue this to completion. I had to see this through. So I continued writing legislators across the country. The next year, 1984, Colorado ratified it. The year after that, 1985, 5 states ratified it. After that, 1986, 3 more. After that, 1987, 4 more. After that, in 1988, 3 more. After that, in 1989, a whopping 7 more. After that, in 1990, 2 more. 1 in 1991. But by that point, we were getting very close to the required 38. And so when 1992 rolled around, all that was needed was 3 more states. So Missouri acted, Alabama acted, and Michigan acted, and Michigan was declared to be the 38th state. It turns out, however, that 200 years earlier, in the year 1792, Kentucky, during its very first month of statehood, and this was forgotten about by historians and archivists, they did not remember that Kentucky, in its first month as a state, also ratified it. So that means that it wasn't really Michigan that put the amendment over the top. It was the state that acted just prior to Michigan, that being Alabama, which officially put the amendment into the U.S. Constitution.
Wow. Your level of knowledge on that is so amazing. The way that you just have all those dates memorized. And Tova, I'm going to jump back to you, but I want to bring in Jewel and Jorn because they're the newest members here of our panel. And I don't want to get too far in here without asking y'all to join the discussion.
Oh, of course. So one thing I was curious about in hearing your story is when you first wrote that paper and handed it in and you received a C as your grade, do you think that that was a byproduct of what was in the paper and the teacher's opinion about what you wrote and not actually the quality of your paper?
Well, the teaching assistant at the time told me that he didn't think that it was an important topic. In later years, the professor said basically the same thing, that she didn't feel that it was an important topic and that procedurally she thought that it couldn't be ratified.
So
I don't think they had a problem with the content of my paper or the manner in which I wrote the paper. They just took the position that it was not an important issue as far as the two of them were concerned.
I have a follow-up question, kind of bounce off Jordan's, which is, did that make it? I assume that the fact that they just didn't think it was important and you had put so much work into it must have been disheartening to you. And I think a lot of students go through that, whether from being very young but to very old through college, both of us just being recent graduates. And my question to you is, what would you want to say to students who believe in something, let's say, and particularly something political in this sense, let's say, but when they turn in their paper, not for really the merits of the paper, but they just get a bad grade? What do you think what would you want to say to those students? Because you turned around and went on quite a tear and ratified an amendment to the Constitution. We might not all do that, but what can we do?
Well, one thing about me, anytime that I know that I'm right about something and someone tries to tell me that it can't be done, there's really no stopping me. If I am in command of the facts, and indeed I was in command of the facts, and if I know that something is needed to be done because there's a problem that is crying out to be addressed, I will pursue it. And I always encourage anyone, whether they're a student or not a student, and whatever age they are, if you know the facts, and if you know that this will resolve a problem that exists, pursue it. Go for it. Don't let anybody try to talk you out of it.
That's great advice. And that's a great question. Tova, do you want to jump back in here?
Yeah, sure. So just going back to the historical context, because this is just so fascinating. Why didn't it pass originally?
Well, my suspicion has always been this. As you know, it was a part of the package of 12 amendments that Congress had sent in 1789 to the state legislatures, which we know as the Bill of Rights. 10 of those 12 were ratified by 1791, Virginia being the state that put them over the top on December the 15th of 1791. And all of the 10 that were approved back at that time pertained to civil rights. The 2 that fell by the wayside, one of them being the Congressional Compensation Amendment, and another one that was a rather complex method of reapportioning the U.S. House of Representatives following each decennial census. Those were the 2 that fell behind. Now, those 2 really do not pertain to civil rights. And so an argument can be plausibly made that the ones that did pertain to civil rights got in to the Constitution in 1791, and the 2 that were not germane to civil rights fell by the wayside. That's the only thing I can come up with, because it's a funny thing. There were states that actually requested the amendment, the Congressional Compensation Amendment, New York being a primary example. And then once that amendment was placed before them, oddly enough, they chose not to approve it. And yet just a few years prior to that, they very specifically asked Congress to pass that amendment. And still to this day, New York has not approved it.
And so, yeah, that's amazing. And so after you did this amazing feat and passed the 27th Amendment, have you stayed involved in politics, and how did this experience inspire your future career and life experiences?
Oh, yes, very much involved. As Kathy had mentioned, I'd worked in the Texas legislature, both the Texas House of Representatives and the Texas Senate, for about 30-something years. So I've stayed very involved with that. Also, I did work for an Austin City Councilman for 2 years, 2015 and 2016. And over the years, I've continued to remain very active in constitutional amendment issues. For example, in 1994, I verified, both with the state of Mississippi as well as with the National Archives, that the Mississippi legislature had never ratified the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. That, of course, is the one that brought an end to slavery in the year 1865. So I began to write letters to all African American members of the Mississippi Senate and the Mississippi House of Representatives, telling them that, look, this is the 1990s, and to this day, the Mississippi legislature has not ratified the 13th Amendment. True, yes, the 13th Amendment is the law of the land, but it would be nice if you would pass a resolution at the state capitol in Jackson to symbolically, belatedly ratify the 13th Amendment. And the following year, 1995, in the month of March, both houses of the Mississippi legislature had approved a resolution to belatedly and symbolically ratify the Constitution's 13th Amendment. That was not the only example. I also discovered that Tennessee lawmakers had never ratified the 15th Amendment. That was the amendment that granted to African American males the right to vote. Even though all African Americans had been freed of slavery from the 13th Amendment, the right to vote was by no means guaranteed. So I verified with the state archives in Nashville and also with the US archives in Washington, D.C. Both of them said, no, there's no record on file that Tennessee ratified the 15th Amendment. So I did the same thing. I contacted all African American members of the Tennessee Senate, all African American members of the Tennessee House of Representatives. I gave them a resolution draft and said, would you please introduce this in the General Assembly and pass it, and thereby making Tennessee symbolically and belatedly on record officially with the 15th Amendment. And so that happened in 1997.
Wow.
That is, yeah, that's inspiring me to crack open some history books. It seems like there's so many hidden things that are waiting for a, passionate young person to push it through, right? But that's really amazing.
You used a very good word, the word hidden, because just like nobody knew that Kentucky in 1792, during their first month of statehood, had ratified the Bill of Rights, there were other states. For example, I didn't find out until a few years after I started that Ohio had ratified the amendment in the year 1873. I also did not know that in the year 1978, just a few years before all this, that Wyoming had ratified. The record keeping at both the state level as well as at the federal level has been deplorable. There may have been other ratifications of the Congressional Compensation Amendment that have been just forgotten to history. And you would literally have to go through the journals of the legislature of every state in the union and the session laws to see if there were any that happened that were forgotten about. Who knows, New York maybe did ratify it and everybody forgot about it because nobody kept good records.
Wow, fascinating. And then when you were reaching out to lawmakers, do you think any of them treated you differently, because you were younger or because you were still a student, or did they treat you with the same respect that they would any other?
Well, understand this. 99% of the time, I was ignored by state lawmakers. The first problem was I was not a resident of their state. So they get a letter from some guy in Texas and they happen to be in Utah. There is a tendency to be dismissive and say, well, not only does this guy not live in my particular legislative district, he doesn't even live in my state. So I'm going to just throw his letter in the garbage and forget about him. But of course, all you need in any state legislature is just one member to file the resolution. So I had gotten to the point that I would literally, I kid you not, I would literally send a letter to every member of the legislature. That way, I could always find at least one member who would agree to file the resolution at the state capitol. It cost a lot of money. You have to remember, back in those days, there was no internet, there was no email. I was having to do all of this the old-fashioned way through United States Postal Service. So it cost me a lot of money over the years. I would estimate that in the 10 years from 1982 to 1992, when you add up the postage, the envelopes, the paper, the Xerox copying, it probably cost me about $5,000 spread out over a period of a decade. But
How?
I'm glad that I spent that money because it got something accomplished that was meaningful. But to get back to your point, most of them ignored me. If I sent out 100 letters, I might get back, if I was lucky, I might get back maybe 4 replies. 2 of those replies would say, well, yeah, it's a very interesting idea, but I'm in the state legislature. You should be writing to US Congress members in Washington, D.C. Then I would get another letter saying, yeah, it's a great idea, and yes, it is before the state legislature, but I'm so busy, my plate is so full that I wouldn't be able to devote the proper amount of attention to it. And then I'd get that 4th letter that would say, yes, I'll be happy to introduce the resolution, and I'll do my best to get it passed through both legislative chambers. And that was all you needed. You just need 1 member to file the resolution at the Capitol.
Wow, aren't we lucky as Americans to have had you donate your time and your effort and everything to get it passed? And before copy and paste, like as a young person, I can't even, it's weird in my brain. You couldn't just send emails or do, send to all. But so what are your tips do you have to getting lawmakers to actually listen to you? I know it was 1%, but that is still, significant. So how did you word your letter, or what tactics did you use? And since you've been in Texas legislature now, do you have any tips for maybe young people who want to reach out, how they might want to word their letters?
Well, first, let me mention that I have not been in the Texas legislature for a few years, and we're talking about young versus mature. My maturity and the fact that I'm 58 years of age has made it extremely difficult for me to reestablish myself in the Texas legislature because the age discrimination in employment is so rampant and so institutionalized. They do not want to hire someone who is 58. They greatly prefer someone who is 22. And so my advancing age has actually been a huge strike against me in that regard. Now, you mentioned a few minutes ago if the state legislatures may be discriminated against me for being too young. Well, no, because nowhere in my letters to them did I say anything about my age. So that was never a factor back in the 1980s and 1990s because nowhere within the letter did I mention my age. Now, what I would mention in the letters was that the amendment would address an ongoing problem, and that was the abuse that members of Congress were engaging in, giving themselves these pay raises. And I would give them several examples. And there was one example that was really, really, really bad. And that was an example from the year 1987. Congress in the 1960s had set up a mechanism by which they would get automatic pay raises unless they voted to reject the pay raise within a very narrow window of time. So if they didn't reject the pay raise within that extremely narrow window of time, then the pay raise would take effect automatically. In that year of 1987, then Speaker Jim Wright basically said, we're going to vote on whether to accept or reject this automatic pay raise. But we're going to vote one day too late. That way, it will look to our constituents that we were rejecting the amendment, but because we're doing that one day too late, we still get to keep the pay raise anyway. So that was really terrible. And I was able to use that to milk a lot of ratifications. I got Arkansas in 1987 as a result of all that. I got Montana. I was really pleased to get Connecticut because even the sponsor in Connecticut didn't think that she could pass it there, but she did. And I also got Wisconsin, and that was with the help of Russ Feingold, who in later years became a U.S. Senator from the state of Wisconsin. So every time that members of Congress abused this privilege, I would just share that with the state legislatures and say, look, here's the problem and here's the solution. Ratify this amendment and that will correct the problem. And so that's what they did. And of course, I made it very clear that there was no deadline. This amendment from 1789 had no deadline. It was still pending before the states. It was not until the year 1917 that Congress first got into the habit of putting deadlines on amendments that they sent out to the states.
Well, you know, and one thing strikes me, something that you said just a few minutes ago, that you would write the state legislators, and they didn't, the state legislators didn't know their constitution well enough to even know that they were the ones that were supposed to be handling it. And they would tell you to write your member of Congress.
It was really embarrassing. And I ran into that early in the process. Now, once Maine had ratified in 1983, and once Colorado had ratified in 1984, that issue evaporated, and I could show that, hey, Maine ratified, Colorado ratified. Then I no longer ran into that situation of state lawmakers not realizing their role in the process of changing the U.S. Constitution.
It just goes to show the need for much more constitutional education. And so Jewel and Jorn, I want to cut back to you. Do y'all have some more questions?
Yeah, we definitely do. We're just listening to the show a little bit. That was very interesting because like any good person on an interview, we got to know Gregory Watson a little bit beforehand and watched certain things, but we're learning a whole lot more now. I know Jordan has a couple, but first, this one kind of stands alone. Thinking about your passion around the 27th Amendment and thinking about abuses that are possible through public office. I think almost anyone can understand that if you can vote yourself a pay raise, that's probably not a good idea. But are there any further laws that you think we need, or any further abuses that are going on now that are not being addressed that have to do with immoral benefit from political office?
Well, I think there are numerous examples, really far too numerous to get into here. But I will say that I've continued to advocate the proposal of other amendments. For example, I think that we do need an amendment to clarify much of the process of amending the Constitution itself. In the 50 states, 49 of those states, the actual voters go into the polling place and vote on amendments to the state constitution. Delaware is the only example where the voters, the electorate after all, have no say in changing the state constitution. So if we trust voters in 49 of the 50 states to go to the polling place and vote to approve or reject amendments to their state constitution, then why do we not trust them to go into the voting booth and also vote on amendments to the federal constitution? So for years, I have been advocating a process by which we clarify the process of amending the Constitution. And here's the way I think it should be done, and I've proposed this to Congress, and it is summarized in the Congressional record among my numerous petitions to both houses of Congress. It should be a 2/3 vote of the U.S. Senate and a 2/3 vote of the U.S. House of Representatives. And when I say a 2/3 vote, I mean a real 2/3 vote. 2/3 of the complete membership. I don't mean 2/3 of whoever happens to be in the room at the particular moment that the vote is being cast, a real 2/3. Then in November of an even numbered year, when voters are going to the polls en masse anyway to vote for president or governor of their state or U.S. senators, U.S. representatives, ask them while they happen to be in the polling place if they approve of or prefer to reject a proposed amendment to the national constitution, just like they can for the state constitution. Another thing that needs to be clarified, there's a lot of talk about calling what is referred to as an Article 5 convention. And that's never been done, but the states have come very close to triggering the calling of an Article 5 convention. Well, there's a huge list of unanswered questions about that. Who would be the delegates? How many delegates? What would be the vote required, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody has hard answers to those questions. I say scrap that whole process, because this is one of the examples where the drafters of the Constitution could have been a lot clearer than they were. There are areas of the Constitution that are not very clear and should be clarified. So just scrap that whole process and let the state legislatures have 2/3 of them pass an identically worded resolution, and just like 2/3 of the two houses of Congress, put it on the national ballot in November of an even-numbered year and let the voters go vote and take care of it in one day. Don't drag it out for centuries or drag it out for decades. Get it squared away on election day in November of an even-numbered year. And if the voters reject it, move on. And if you still think it's a good idea, try to re-propose it. That happens all the time in state constitutions. If the voters reject an amendment to the state constitution, there may be a future attempt to put it before them again and see if, changing the words a little bit, the voters will approve it this go round.
Well, those are fascinating ideas. I want to make sure we get to some audience questions, because we could probably sit here and talk for 2 hours. I think this is just such a great story. And Lucia Lee Booth asked, did the professor or TA ever show any appreciation for Gregory Watson's achievement in 1992?
Well, what happened was in 2017, just a few years ago, a current professor at the University of Texas managed to track down my 1982 professor. He convinced her that even 35 years later, that my grade should be changed from a C to an A. Because you have to remember, not only did I get a C on that paper that I wrote, I also got a C overall in her class. So she agreed, and she did sign the paperwork to the registrar to 35 years belatedly elevate my overall course grade in her class from a C to an A. And the registrar at the University of Texas said that in the history of the university, that was the longest, most belated grade change that he had ever been confronted with.
You were finally vindicated.
After 35 years.
After 35 years, that's so great. And then Kobe Chase wants to know, he says, your work amending the US Constitution gave you a pretty amazing skill set. How did that help you in your career in the Texas legislature?
Well, it really didn't enhance or detract from my ability to function in the Texas legislature, because you have to remember, I had already started in the Texas legislature before I ever wrote that term paper. So I was already on staff at the Texas Capitol building at the time that I wrote that paper.
Oh.
I will say that I have run into situations where it has actually worked against me. There have been members of the Texas legislature who got very angry and very upset when someone later informed them that there is an amendment in the US Constitution because of my actions. In fact, there was one legislator who blew up at me and told me that I was never, ever to think for a single moment that I had accomplished anything meaningful in my life because the voters had elected her to the Texas House of Representatives, not me to the Texas House of Representatives, and that I was always to remain very mindful while on her payroll that she was the big cheese and I was a speck of dust. And 4 days later, she terminated both me and another guy whom she had hired on Tuesday. And both he and I were out the door by Friday of that same week. So I don't really advertise it when I'm looking for employment in the Texas legislature, because I'm very paranoid of that very negative, jealous reaction.
Well, I guess it can cut both ways. Danya Konecki, one of our students who's watching, asks, can states change their vote on pending amendments, and is there a time limit on them?
Well, I will say this, relative to the 1972 Equal Rights Amendment, this issue did come before the federal judiciary. And in the case of Idaho versus Freeman, a judge in December of 1981 ruled that, yes, in his estimation, if a state legislature rescinds its earlier ratification of an amendment and does that prior to the magic 38th state, because with 50 states in the union, you've got to have 38 of those 50 states. As long as they rescind before the magic 38th state, that's doable. When that case came before the US Supreme Court the following month, in January of 1982, the justices were not eager to venture into that thicket of complexity. And so all the Supreme Court did was to stay, quote unquote, stay Idaho versus Freeman, which did not disagree with the lower court on the merits of the controversy, but merely suspended the operation of that lower court's ruling. As you know, the court goes on a sabbatical starting around the end of June, the beginning of July, and they're on hiatus for about 3 months. When they came back for their October term in October of 1982, since the revised deadline of June 30th, 1982 had come and gone, they chose to take the easy way out and simply declare that the entire matter was moot and that they were not going to get deep into the woods as to the issues raised by the lower court in the case of Idaho versus Freeman.
Okay. And then Sandy Thatcher, who is one of our loyal listeners, I wanted to be sure he's asking a follow-up on the ERA, just asking, he says it's his understanding that once a law is passed doing away with the time limit on ratification, that it could get ratified. And what do you think its chances are? And if you could just try to keep your answer quick, because we want to get back to Jewel and Jorn one last time if we can.
Well, the Supreme Court, of course, in the year 1921, in the case of Dillon versus Gloss, did indeed rule that if Congress wants to put a deadline on an amendment, it has the power to do that. I think that that's probably a wise thing to do, because you can run into a situation like the Corwin Amendment from 1861, which would have preserved the institution of slavery in those states which at that time had the institution of slavery. So I do think it is important that there be some expiration date, but I think it's more important that voters go into the voting booth in November of an even numbered year and vote on it one day and either reject it or approve it.
Okay. And Jewel and Jorn, do y'all have any closing questions, comments, thoughts? This has been a great discussion. I know it's been so inspiring to the students, especially on this today.
Well, I would like to say first a great big thank you to Gregory Watson. There was a lot of information in there, and I definitely learned a lot about how you can approach state representatives and really change something that's important to you. And the more citizens that we can get to care about amendments to our Constitution and the importance of it, I think the better.
And we're here at Constituting America, so of course, you know, it's important to us. This organization, you know their mission, and you know this is really what we're trying to do, and we've benefited from it greatly. And what I guess I would like you to maybe leave the listeners with and us with is that what is the tangible way that no matter what your age, no matter who you are, if you want to affect change politically, what's your first step?
Well, your first step is to write a narrative of what the problem is that you're trying to fix and what the solution is to fix that particular problem. Make it easy for elected officials, because if you don't make it easy for them, they'll just set it aside and forget it. So define what the problem is, define what the solution is, put it on a piece of paper, or in today's world, email it to them, and keep it as simple for them as possible. Because if it's not made simple for them, they'll ignore it.
And that's so great that you would say that, because that's exactly what Janine teaches the kids when she goes into the classrooms. She spends a lot of time working with them, teaching them how to write a petition and how to, just exactly what you said, how to identify a problem, identify something they want to change. And she always says the first step is to put it on paper, write your petition out. And I think you have alerted us to something that we didn't know, and a lot of our listeners may not know, that if you present a petition to Congress, that they will actually publish it in the Congressional Record and assign it to a committee. Is that true? And just quickly, how do you do that?
Well, I type up and I put it on, I use a pretty font with Old English and make it look as official as I can. And I mail it to the parliamentarian of the U.S. House of Representatives and another one to the parliamentarian of the U.S. Senate. Technically, it has to be addressed to the Speaker of the House, but on the envelope, send it to the parliamentarian. And then on the Senate side, technically, it has to be addressed to the Vice President of the United States, who is the official presiding officer of the U.S. Senate. But make the envelope addressed to the parliamentarian so it doesn't go astray. And the House of Representatives will print, they'll say something to the effect of, the Speaker presented a petition of Mr. Gregory D. Watson of Austin, Texas, seeking enactment of federal legislation that would make it unlawful for a mere credit inquiry alone by itself to constitute a blemish upon that person's overall credit worthiness. And then it'll say, which was referred to the Committee on Financial Services. The Senate doesn't do as good of a job. They used to do what the House did. They used to say the person's name, the city that they are in. Now the Senate will only say a petition from a citizen of the state of Texas. It won't mention my name. It won't mention the city of Austin. It'll just say that I'm from Texas. And then it'll be really, really stingy with information. Whereas the House got into detail, the Senate will say something like, relative to federal legislation dealing with credit. And they'll leave you hanging, guessing as to what this person in Texas asked for. So, but both chambers will put it in the Congressional Record, and both chambers will refer it to their respective committees.
Do you have to get any number of signatures, or can it just be a few signatures?
It can just be you all by your little old self.
Wow, and you just send it to the parliamentarian. That is amazing. And when we review the show, we may put something up on the screen that shows us. But we've got just a little bit of time left here, and we have a very special surprise guest, Takari Chapman, who has been on many of our past constitutional Zooms, is a working actor. He's out in Los Angeles just got a break on set, and popped on real fast to say hello, because Takari is not going to be able to be on as many of our chats going forward because of some of the new opportunities that he's getting in Hollywood. So Takari, do you want to say a brief hello to everyone? And I hate to say goodbye. I know we're not saying goodbye to you, but say hello.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here and catch the tail end of what Mr. Watson was saying. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting this wonderful organization. To Jewel and Jordan, I haven't seen you guys in forever. So, hey, guys. But yeah, this has been amazing. Thank you. And thank you, Kathy and Janine.
And so, Gregory, I think our time has come to an end, but gosh, I mean, you were like a rock star to Constituting America. You were the one person that we talk about in our school speeches, probably more than any other person that I can think of, except maybe George Washington. And so we thank you for being an inspiration and for all that you have done for our country and for showing, everyone listening today and everyone that hears your story, that one person truly can make a difference. It just takes one energized, passionate person like you, and look at what you did. So we're so blessed to finally get to meet you and blessed by the gift of your time today. So thank you.
It has been my pleasure.
And we want to invite everyone to be with us next week. We've got a very exciting guest again to follow on in Gregory Watson's footsteps. We have Senator Ted Cruz, and he's going to be coming on Tuesday, March 9th at 2 p.m. Eastern. He's going to be talking about Amendments 20 and 22, and may even tell us a little bit about his initiative for term limits. So that should be an exciting show. And we again want to thank our sponsors, Ray and Roxanne Bromley, who are great advocates of civic education out in Pennsylvania. Ray and Roxanne, thank you for sponsoring this episode. So we hate to say goodbye, but we're going to say goodbye for now and see y'all next week. So thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you. A shout out to Takari. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Bye.